Welcome to this video on MLA format and documentation or citing, how to cite correctly. In this video, you're going to learn about what MLA is and how to use it as a documentation style, and also how to approach citing something and what sorts of things need to be cited. Obviously, you are into the research paper, and so knowing how to not only find research, but being able to cite it correctly and avoid plagiarism is going to be very important. All right, so let's talk about some documentation basics. What is MLA style and why do I need to know this? Well, MLA style, just like APA style or Chicago style, is a style that's used to format your actual document, but it's also the style that you'll use when citing sources that have been used from other um, resources that were not just from your brain. All right, so when we talk about documentation, when your teacher states that you're going to use either APA or MLA, he or she's just simply directing you to use a certain system that reveals to your reader what sources and information you have utilized in the writing of your paper. The documentation style will determine, as we mentioned, the formatting of the paper in the document itself. Now, MLA stands for Modern Language Association, just like APA stands for American Psychological Association. So the Modern Language Association, MLA, is what we use in English. They also use it in history, in some other subject areas. Some general rules for formatting a paper in MLA style. First of all, you double space the entire document. You use size 12 point font. Times New Roman is the font that is the approved MLA. Now, I've been letting you use other fonts within reason, but you need to know that Times New Roman size 12 is the official MLA font. You do not use bolded text for your titles or for the title on the bibliography page, which in MLA we call the works cited page. All margins, left, right, up, and down, are set to 1-inch margins. Every new paragraph should be indented a ½ inch from the margin. Usually, your word processing program has been set up so that you could hit the tab key on your keyboard and it would move you over that required ½ inch indentation. If you've got a long or block quote, which we'll talk about in more length later, it should be indented 2 indentions. So you'd hit that tab key twice. And so you'd have that full inch that you come over from that left alignment. All those lines of that long quote or that block quote are aligned against that new double indented line. All right, so when we talk about documentation, we have a two-part documentation style in MLA. The first part of that is what you stop within the text of the paper and cite. So as soon as you've brought in material from an outside source, whether you have directly quoted it, whether you've paraphrased it, or whether you've summarized it, you have got to provide that parenthetical citation, that in the text citation. Then the second part of the documentation is that works cited page source entry. So whatever you've placed in that parenthetical citation, the author, the page it was found on, that information can send that reader of your paper to the works cited page where they could find the complete information on that source so that they could literally go look up that source themselves. The in-text citation acts as a key to your bibliography or to that works cited page. It directs you to your reader, or directs your reader to those specific sources. Now, in MLA, that in-text citation is going to include the author's last name, and it's going to include the page number. So, last name, page number, those are what's included for MLA. Now, in your in-text citation, you have to give credit to the source anytime you use information from the source in the following ways, whether you have directly quoted a word, a phrase, a sentence, a paragraph, whatever from that original source, you've got to give credit to that source. If you put it into your own words instead of directly quoting it, you still have to give credit to that source. Or if you summarize it, you still need to give credit to that source. Now, there are different types of quotations. One of those is what we call the long quote or the block quotation. Now, you have to have more than 3 lines, so a 4-line minimum is necessary, and those are typed lines. If you are using material from a text and you're directly quoting it and it is at least 4 lines in typing, then you have to set that quote off from the main body of the paragraph like a block, and I'll show you an example in a minute. Integrated quotations, or what we call small quotes. These are little things that you add within the text of the paper that are not 4 typed lines, okay? You want to make sure that those 3 lines of text or fewer flow seamlessly into the paragraph. So with block quote, it's set off from the rest of the paper in what looks like a block of information versus small quotes or integrated quotes that are just going to be within the regular text of the paper and flow seamlessly from one idea to the next. All right, so here's an example of a block quote in its proper format. So you have to set up the quote, all right? And so once you've set up the quote, you use a colon. Then remember that double indentation, right? You're tabbing over twice. And so the first part, the first word of the quote is on that new double indented margin. You go all the way to the natural end of the line on the right margin. You go back to that double indented line, and you follow this procedure for all of these lines of this directly quoted long quote. It creates a block. Notice every line is left aligned on that double indentation. The right margin just casually there. All right. Now let's talk about, this is indented. This was double indented, but this is double spaced, just like the rest of the paper. There's no special spacing going on. You've got no quotation marks used because we've set this off from the rest of the paper, so it's obvious that this is quoted material. So no quotation here, no quotation here. Now, in most of our parenthetical citations, the period will go after the parentheses. But you can see that in a long quote situation or a block quote, we have the period at the end of the quoted material. Then we have the parenthetical citation, no punctuation after the parentheses. So again, only for long or block quotes do you have the period before the parentheses. With other quotes, the period comes after the parentheses. Now, here's an example of an integrated quote. Notice within this paragraph, okay, this information from a source is worked in, okay? Now, notice what the source information says. Is Lion Authority John Seidensticker remarks. So we've tagged the author of that information, the one who actually wrote or said this. You've got the comma, then you've got the open quotes. You have the exact quoted material, close the quotes, no end punctuation until after the parentheses. Now notice this is the page number in the parentheses. We've already tagged the author, so we don't need to have the author's last name and the page number. We've already got the author's last name. We only need the page number where that information can be found. Period after the parentheses. Also, one more thing about that one. Notice how, and then we go straight from that quoted material right into the rest of this paragraph smoothly. It has been smoothly incorporated into the paper. A paraphrase or summary. Now, there is this misconception out there that if you put it into your own words, you don't have to cite it. That is bull. You did not know that information beforehand. That information did not uniquely come to you and from your brain. You paraphrase that based on another source's information. So with the paraphrase or the summary, and we'll talk more about those in a little while, the distinctions between those. Obviously, this is in your own words, but so we don't have direct quotes, right? But you still want this to flow smoothly within the paragraph, and you still have to give credit to the source. All right, so let's take a look at this one because this is a unique situation as well for documenting. The suggestion that there is a continuity in the linguistic abilities of apes and humans has created much controversy. Linguist Noam Chomsky has strongly asserted that language is a human characteristic. Booth, 24. All right, so let's talk about this. Smoothly incorporated information, no period until after the parentheses of the parenthetical citation. Okay, now let's talk about something. Notice the person who gave us the information, the person whose idea this is linguist Noam Chomsky, okay? But we have a different name in the parentheses. So let's talk about this situation that you might encounter. If I were to have put Chomsky in the parentheses, then I would expect to see Chomsky as a source on the works cited page. But there is no Chomsky source. The source that was used to access this information about linguist Noam Chomsky was the Booth source. The author of that source, his last name was Booth. So if I would have just put Chomsky in the parentheses, that would be me saying Chomsky said this, and it was in a Chomsky source, and that's a lie. That's not true. Chomsky did say it, but it was not in a source he wrote. So we have to give credit to Booth. We have to give credit to the author of the source. But we also can't say by just having Booth in the parentheses that Booth is the one that had this idea, because that's not true either. So we credit the source where we access the information, Booth, but we also in the sentence give credit to the person whose idea this happens to be. All right, now let's take a look at a sample first page of an MLA paper. First of all, MLA format does not require a title page. Okay? On the very first page of the document, just like every other essay you've written for me this semester, you will have your last name, a space, and the page number. The whole document is double spaced. So the MLA heading, no extra spacing between that and the title. No extra spacing between the title and the first line of the text of the paper. We have the MLA heading. Remember, it contains your name, my name, our course, and the date that the assignment is due. Even if you were completing this paper a week in advance, it doesn't matter. The due date should be the same, whatever date it's due, okay? A creative title, indented paragraphs, okay? First line of the paragraph's indented. Every line after that in that paragraph left the line, indent for the next paragraph, all right? You notice your title is centered in the page. On every page of this paper, you should have your last name, space, and a page number, including the works cited page. Now, on page 2 of your paper, notice there is no MLA heading. It's only on page 1. You still have last name, page number. And the format of the paper is the same. We're indenting paragraphs, left aligning, all of those things that we talked about on the previous page. There's a very helpful website for you. It's called the OWL at Purdue, the Online Writing Lab. It's what OWL stands for. Now, this website has accurate guides for both MLA and APA format, annotated sample papers, examples of different types of works cited entries, and detailed information concerning punctuation, grammar, and other writing-related topics. They have things like how to do a resume, They have all kinds of grammatical content, everything you might need in the way of help with your writing. All right, so that brings us to talking about quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. You're going to be using research material that you have quoted, paraphrased, or summarized in order to help support the points that you've established in your paper. Now, this is an interesting quote from a writer of your book. When you work with the ideas and words of others, you need to clearly distinguish those ideas and words from your own and give credit to their authors. Okay. So you go to put one reason I have you do that method of, writing your paper first and then adding in the research is so that you can avoid plagiarism. Now, everything you're adding into your paper from a source has got to be cited because all of your words were used in the rest of the paper. And now everything you put into this paper has to be cited. So let's talk a little bit about some good record keeping things you can do to make sure that you're keeping track of where you got information. So one thing you can do is write enough information down so that later when you refer to it, you'll be reminded of its main points and have a precise record of where it came from. So as you find your sources, make sure you label those sources. Make sure you maybe jot down some notes about what's contained in those sources. If you use a particular line from that source, write it down or copy paste that with quotation marks into a document and cite that source in your notes. Take notes in your own words and use your own sentence patterns. That'll also help you avoid plagiarism. And when you find wording that you would like to quote, be sure to enclose those in those quotation marks to distinguish your source's words from your own. It is so easy for us to read things and forget we read them, or we write down notes exactly as it was, written, and we say later we're going to put it into our own words, but we don't. So do some good record keeping. Label each note with a number to identify the source and the subject heading. So whether you're doing this electronically or whether you are doing this, using just the old, handwritten method. If you're taking notes from an article, give that article a number. It's your second source. So put a number 2 at the top of your page. So everything you can do to keep accurate records and take notes appropriately is going to help you in the long run when it comes to doing those citations in your paper. So let's talk about the distinction between quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing. You have to decide which method you're going to use. And I'm going to tell you right now, the best thing for you to do is use a little bit of each of these. You want variety in your paper. You don't want everything to just look like you copied and pasted quoted material into your paper. You also want to have some areas where you've paraphrased information or you've summarized. So there's some general rules of thumb when we talk about quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing. Quote the text. Quote from a text when the wording is worth repeating, or it makes a point so well that there's no rewording it in order, no way that you could reword it would do justice to that wording. Okay, a lot of times we're just lazy and we don't want to put it into our own words, so we just end up quoting a bunch of stuff. That's not the way to write a good paper. Quote a text when you want to cite the exact words of a known authority on your topic. Use a quote when an authority's opinions challenge or disagree with those of others, or when the source is one that you really want to emphasize. Now, when it comes to paraphrasing, remember that means putting it into your own words. Paraphrase sources that are not worth quoting, but they still contain details that you'd like to include. And then, of course, summarizing you want to use for longer passages. Maybe you read a whole article and you summarize the main points that were important Maybe the details weren't important, but the main points were. So you could actually summarize an entire article in just a sentence or so. Maybe you have a certain long passage within that article that it has some good information, but it's too long to, directly quote. So you can summarize, and summarize always means making it smaller, okay? Whereas paraphrase is usually about the same length. All right, so let's talk about quoting. And when we talk about quoting, we're talking about directly quoting. Quoting a source is a way of weaving someone else's exact words into your text. So you need to reproduce the source exactly, though you can modify it to omit unnecessary details. Like you can use that ellipsis, that dot, 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 to omit unnecessary details. You can also, in order to make it fit more smoothly into your text, you can use brackets. Like maybe there's some information that you need to add in to make things understandable, then you can use those brackets. You also need to distinguish quoted material from your own by enclosing short quotations and quotation marks. Set off longer quotes, remember that 4 or more type lines, as a block, and use those appropriate signal phrases. So when we think about short quotes versus long quotes, you're going to be incorporating those short quotes into your text enclosed in those quotation marks. Short quotations in MLA style are defined as 4 or more type lines. For 3 lines or fewer of poetry, if you're quoting lines of poetry, a long or short quote would be 3 or less lines, whereas a short quote in other types of text is 4 or less lines. Separate the lines of poetry with slashes, leaving 1 space on each side of the slashes. Here's an example. Emma Lazarus also almost speaks for the Statue of Liberty with the words inscribed on its pedestal. Notice again, you've got the colon because the quote's been introduced. And quote, give me you're tired, you're poor. There's the slash for where that line of poetry ended and the next one begins. Notice there's a space before the slash and after the slash. Your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, comma, space, slash, space. Next line of poetry, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore, close the quote, parentheses for the page in which it was on, because we've already tagged the author, we just need the page. Close you've got open parentheses 58, close parentheses, period after the parentheses. This is a short quote, okay? Set off long quotes, 5 or more type lines with block style. Indent the quote 1/2 inch or 5 spaces from the left margin, and do not use quotation marks. Okay, so let's refer back to that. You set off long quotes of 4 or more type lines as a block. Okay, you're going to indent that double indentation, right, which is 10 spaces from the left margin. And if it is that block, if you are doing this block quote, remember you do not need quotation marks at the beginning or the end, but you will put that parenthetical documentation after any of the end punctuation. Remember, the block quote's the one time that the period comes before the closing parentheses. So here's an example of a long quote, also called a block style quote. Nonprofit organizations such as XAM and Habitat for Humanity rely on visual representations of the poor. What better way to get our attention? Ask rhetorician Diana George. Notice we've set up the quote. We use a colon. Then the block starts, right? Double indentation, 10 spaces. And you've got the long quote, all right? No quotation at the beginning, none at the end, period before the parenthetical citation. Only need the page number because we had the author's name before the quote started. All right. Indicate anything that's been left out from that original material with what we call an ellipses, the dot, dot, dot. You sometimes delete words from a quotation that are unnecessary for your point. Insert 3 ellipsis marks, leaving a space before the first and after the last one to indicate the deletion. All right. So Fagley points out that Gore's open, or this is the term, okay, information superhighway metaphor. So that's the name of a particular metaphor. Open the quotes, associated the economic prosperity of the 50s and 60s and space, the ellipsis, right? Space, 1960s facilitated by new highways with the potential for vast space, space, commerce to be conducted over the internet. Close the quote, parentheses with the 253, the period at the end. All right. So if any information, this tells us that information was left out of that original cited material. Look at the next one. If you omit a sentence or more in the middle of a quotation, put a period before the 3 ellipsis dots. Be careful not to distort the source's meaning, however. Let's look at the sample. According to Welch, comma, open the quotes, television is more acoustic than visual, space, Okay, and so since they have left out a sentence or more in the middle of this quotation, we also have a space and a period. Okay, so that shows we left out more than a few words. We left out some sentences. One can turn one's gaze away from the television, but one cannot turn one's ears from it without leaving the area where the monitor leaks its aural signals into every corner. Close the quote. Parenthetical citation, page 102, because we've already had Welch tagged in the sentence. Close the parentheses, a period. So whenever you see ellipsis or whenever you use ellipsis, it is to show that material has been deleted from the earlier, from the quoted material. Whether it is, some words or phrases or whatever, but if it happens to be a couple sentences, a sentence or more, you've got to use the ellipsis, a space, and a period so that it's known that it was multiple sentences. Indicate additions or changes with brackets. Sometimes you'll need to change or add words in a quotation to make the quotation fit grammatically within your sentence. For example, or maybe you just want to add a comment. In the following example, the writer changes the passage, quote, one of our goals, quote, to clarify the meaning of our. So if you've lifted a piece of information from the source and the information that came before what you're using had clarified who our was, you probably need to add in a bracket with the information of who that our refers to. So let's look at the example. Writing about the dwindling attention among some composition scholars to the actual teaching of writing, Susan Miller notes that, quote, few discussions of writing pedagogy take it for granted that one of the brackets writing teachers' goals is to teach how to write. Close the quotation, parenthetical citation with the page 480. Close the parentheses, period at the end. We've already had Miller, so we know who said this, and the page it can be found on is 480. So instead of our goals, okay, this writer identifies who our was referring to, okay, by adding in that information in brackets. Here's an example of brackets used to add explanatory words to a quotation. Barbosa observes that Baroque's lyrics have long included, quote, many a metaphor of Salsati's yearning, so characteristics of fado music, end of quote. So this bracket that has yearning in it tells us what is meant by that term, Salsati's. All right, period after the parentheses. We've already identified Barbosa in this sentence. Using punctuation correctly with quotations. When you incorporate a quotation into your text, you have to think about the end punctuation in that quoted material, and also about any punctuation that you need to add when you insert the quote into your own sentence. Put periods or commas inside quotation marks. So let that sink in. Periods and commas go inside the quotation marks except when you have a parenthetical documentation at the end, in which case you always put that period or comma after the parentheses, except for the case of the long quote, right? So here's the example. Country music. So the quote is going to pause to identify the person who says it and then pick back up. So country music, the comma goes inside the quotes. Teachy says, comma, open the quotes. Notice not a capital letter because we're just continuing the same sentence, is a crucial and vital part of the American identity. Close the quotes, 23 in parentheses, period after the parentheses. We didn't need teachy because we've already identified teachy in the sentence. After long quotations, set off the block style with no quotation marks. However, the period goes before the documentation. And so we've talked about this before. For a long quote, the period, there's no quotation marks, but the period goes before the parenthetical citation. More punctuating correctly with quotations. Quotation marks and exclamation points go inside closing quotation marks if they are part of the quoted material. They go outside of the quotation marks when they are not part of the quoted material. If there's a parenthetical documentation at the end of the quotation, any of the punctuation that's part of your sentence comes after it. So let's look at the examples. Speaking at a 4th of July celebration in 1852, comma, Frederick Douglass asks, comma, open the quotes, what have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? So the question mark is put inside the quotes because this is an actual question that he asked, but it is not the end of the sentence. It is part of a full sentence, but it was a question within this sentence, okay? So you have the question mark, close the quotes, 35 in parentheses, period after the parentheses. But look at this one. This whole thing is a question. So the question for the sentence, it becomes the ending punctuation. It'll go after the parentheses. Who can argue with W. Charisse Goodman's observations that media images persuade women that, quote, thinness equals happiness and fulfillment, end of quote. Close the parentheses with 53, quotation or question mark after the parentheses. Now, colons and semicolons, they always go outside closing quotation marks. It's hard to argue with W. Charisse Goodman's observations that media images persuade women that, quote, thinness equals happiness and fulfillment. Then some more sentences coming, okay? So there is a closing of that quoted material, a semicolon, the conjunctive adverb nevertheless, which provides transition into the next independent clause, and a comma afterwards. American women today are more overweight than ever. Now, parenthetical citation with 53 because we've already cited Goodman in the sentence, period after the parentheses. Paraphrasing. Restating information from a source in your own words is what we call paraphrasing. But you have to also use your own sentence structure. You cannot be copying the organization or the sentence structure of that source. If you are truly paraphrasing, you are putting it into your own words and your own sentence structure. Paraphrase when the source material is important, but that original wording is not. Because it includes all the main points of the source, a paraphrase is usually about the same length as the original. Whereas, remember, we said that summary is going to be shorter. Paraphrase is about the same size as the information from the original source. Some guidelines for paraphrasing. Use your own words and sentence structure. Introduce paraphrase text with signal phrases. Put in quotation marks for any of the source's original phrasing that you use. Indicate the source. Make sure you've given credit to the source. Just because you put it in your own words doesn't mean this was your property. This was someone else's idea and their property. Summarizing, stating the main ideas in a source concisely and in your own words. Unlike the paraphrase, the summary does not present all the details. It is not, it is brief as possible. It's condensing a chunk of information down to a smaller form. Summaries can actually condense a whole book or an essay into a single sentence, or they may take a paragraph or more to present the main ideas. Some guidelines for summarizing include only the main ideas, leave out the details, use your own words, indicate the source. All of these things are important when you're summarizing. So when you're introducing source material into your paper, a lot of times you're using signal phrases. You want to introduce those quotations, paraphrases, and summaries clearly, usually letting your reader know who the author is and, if need be, something about his or her credentials. You should craft each signal phrase you use so as to highlight the credentials of the author. Some common signal verbs. MLA requires present tense verbs in their signal phrases. So here's kind of a little chart of some different words that you could use to signal some information from a source is coming. So maybe instead of always saying that so-and-so notes this, or they suggest this, or they imply this, you can use some different words, argues, confirms, all kinds of different possibilities. But notice all of these are in present tense verbs. You always want to use a present tense verb in a signal phrase. Okay, so that concludes our discussion on the basics of MLA formatting and documentation style, and then which types of things you need to be citing and how you need to be doing those within your paper. Don't forget that two-part documentation style where you've got a parenthetical citation in the paper at the exact place you brought information from a source into that paper, and then you've also got the full source entry on the works cited page. So that concludes our lecture. Thank you for joining me. You're going to want to make certain you understand your assignment and make sure that you watch the video on how to find sources. Thank you for joining me.